So, welcome everyone. Welcome to another Facebook Live, and today I'm doing a bit of a deep dive into this topic of leptin. So, this sort of hormone that a lot of us have heard things about, but there's certainly a lot of misunderstanding around leptin, and in a lot of ways, I actually think it's the missing link when we're looking at trying to uh, rebalance and correct health, especially in that sort of postnatal period. So leptin is a very important hormone during pregnancy and in that postnatal period. And when things get upset in terms of inflammation and sleep deprivation, then you can end up having a lot of problems with this key hormone. So I just really want to sort of dive down into that today. And and a little bit about the history of leptin. What do we actually know about it? There's still a lot to be sort of found out that isn't known yet about leptin and its roles. Um, and the word leptin comes from the Greek leptos, meaning thin. So when it was initially discovered in 1994, they thought this was the hormone that created thinness, if you like. And so the researchers discovered this um, was studying this mouse called the agouti mouse, and the agouti mouse was famous because it was obese, massively obese, and they realized that this mouse had no leptin in its system, and so they thought, oh my goodness, well, if we can find a leptin analog, so again, a tweaked molecule that pharmaceutical industry can patent. They've cracked $1 trillion industry in terms of managing obesity. And so for 10 years, there was a huge amount of research that went on into leptin. By the time they came to clinical trials for humans, they realized that most humans actually had not too little leptin, they actually had too much leptin. They had leptin resistance. And so uh, the pharmaceutical industry sort of dropped leptin like a hot potato, and the research after 2004, 2005 has really sort of slowed down. Um, but and what's interesting for me is leptin has some similarities to insulin in terms of its mechanism. So insulin, if you've got no insulin, and again, insulin regulates sugar. No insulin is type 1 diabetes. You need insulin. Um, and type 2 diabetes is actually the opposite, where your receptors become insensitive and resistant to insulin. And so the insulin that you produce isn't enough. And so you end up getting the same disease, diabetes, but from a very different sort of starting point. And so I think what the scientists realized is that they were looking at sort of a type 2 leptin issue with the resistance and not the type 1 leptin absence that they were studying in the mice. And leptin is produced by fat cells called adipocytes. And in response to increasing blood levels of fatty acids. So when you're digesting food and you're having fatty acids coming in to your bloodstream, the fat cells actually sense that. They produce leptin in response to that, and then that leptin signals the brain um, to behave in a certain way. And so the brain uses that leptin signal to actually sense how much fat storage there is. Because if you're eating fat, those fatty acids are coming in. The more fat you have, the louder the leptin signal is, and then the body can sort of then make adjustments in terms of reducing appetite, and so prevent overeating and unnecessary weight gain. And so, but with leptin resistance, what happens, and we'll explain a little bit about the inflammatory side of things, but essentially what happens with leptin resistance is that the brain becomes, it doesn't get the signal from the fat cells about the leptin being there, and so the fat cells actually start to produce more leptin, and the brain still doesn't hear that signal in a particularly sort of loud fashion, and that's what leptin resistance is. And so the brain is tricked into thinking that the body is super skinny. So if you can um, sort of just follow that. So if you actually have excess weight and producing excess leptin and your leptin resistance, but the brain is getting a signal that it thinks that you're super skinny. Um, the whole mathematics of calories in, calories out, of exercise just doesn't work anymore, because when people with leptin resistance exercise too much, they will burn muscle before they'll start burning fat. If people with leptin resistance start to restrict their calories, um, that will trick the body into thinking it's this famine is actually way worse than it was, and it will slow the body down, and you can actually gain weight. And so, and I've had so many people say to me over the years, it doesn't matter what I eat. Sometimes when I eat less, I gain weight. And this is because of leptin resistance. And the brain is trying to regulate what it thinks it's going on. And how does the brain actually know if we're fat or skinny? It doesn't. Your brain just doesn't look at yourself and go, oh, okay, I'm carrying this amount of kilos of fat. It only knows through the leptin signal. And And so when you have leptin resistance, it causes a situation that the researchers call a fake starvation. So um, again, the brain thinks that there's a food shortage going on. And so the brain literally makes every decision with that fake starvation in mind, when in fact it's the opposite. There are too many calories around. And leptin resistance in mothers is quite a unique and understudied sort of field, and leptin resistance is essentially caused by two main factors. Um, One is direct inflammation affecting the brain, and so this inflammation can come from a lot of different sources. It can come from people with mold illness, people with infections. Um, Typically might biotoxin illness, might typically get inflammation in the hypothalamus. So there's a very specific part of the brain where those leptin receptors are. And then there's a whole other group of people who can get leptin resistance, and these are things like emotional stress. So if you have ongoing emotional stress, part of the reason why you can start to gain weight, even when your calories don't change, is because of that developing leptin resistance. Cortisol has a key role in this. So people have a lot of cortisol issues and fatigue, can start to develop leptin resistance. And then the other major one that we see is sleep deprivation. So this whole disruption of the day-night rhythm, the circadian rhythm, um, can very much lead to leptin resistance. And so this is part of the thinking where night shift workers are much more prone to weight gain than people who are not having to sort of do night duties, or people who are doing different shifts. So they're doing evening, night, morning, and that shifting around are much more prone to developing leptin resistance and then weight gain. And then a couple of unique things that will cause uh, increase in leptin, and an increase in leptin, the possibility of developing leptin resistance is pregnancy, and then the inflammatory conditions within pregnancy, such as preeclampsia and gestational diabetes. And they really can raise your leptin levels and start that process of leptin resistance. And so a mother who's having excessive inflammation during pregnancy is much more prone to potentially developing leptin resistance after the pregnancy, and especially if there are challenges in terms of these neuroinflammatory disorders that that I'm always talk about, with postnatal depletion, and then also with sleep deprivation. So Sometimes, I hear my mothers sort of say that things are going really well up until month 6 or something, and then suddenly the baby's not sleeping well. And as soon as the sleep deprivation just goes from a mild issue to a major issue, then that leptin resistance, weight gain, can really um, you know, start, as it were. And so, leptin is involved with so many things. Without trying to overwhelm everyone, I'm just going to start digging down into some of the roles that what leptin does. And I think the thing that really just opened my mind in terms of how profound leptin was looking at how there are different receptor types within the body. And so even though leptin is the same molecule, it has different effects depending on where those receptors are. And then the brain has its own unique receptor that isn't found anywhere else in the body. And leptin's got a very complicated mechanism of getting into the brain and then to affect those receptors. And those leptin receptors are in a very tiny part of the brain, in the hypothalamus, and it's right adjacent to um, the where the paraventricular nucleus is, and this is the area that makes mothers very prone to all the neuroinflammatory disorders after children, including depression, anxiety, and postnatal depletion. And so, the aha moment for me was realizing that leptin has different effects in different parts of the body, and there are compartments. And so, leptin has a certain effect in the liver, has a certain effect in the skeletal muscle, a certain effect within the digestive tract, but then in the brain, it's got a very unique signal and unique receptors. And if those receptors are damaged through inflammation, which easily happens, then you can have leptin resistance within the brain, but not anywhere else in the body. And so the rest of the body is kind of behaving like everything's okay. And then this particular signal around how much weight am I carrying as a person gets totally scrambled. And that then has major flow-on effects in terms of how the brain then reacts to other things in the world, and then other hormones and other inflammatory. There's a huge cascade that sort of occurs, and so I want to talk a little bit about some of the aspects because I think they're important. But this talk could be a 3-hour talk if I just kind of looked at everything that is known about leptin in mothers. And so here we have a mother who has increased leptin. So Kristen's asking about leptin and thyroid, and I'm going to get to that because that's a really fascinating topic. And so, we have a mother who's going through pregnancy. Her leptin will go up because of the placenta and the baby. And high leptin is actually really normal and healthy during the pregnancy. But then she's also in this controlled inflammatory state. So her leptin receptors may already be starting to be sensitized, if you like. And then if there's too much inflammation either during the pregnancy or postnatally, these cytokines can get into the brain and actually start to either destroy the receptors or make the receptors kind of just sort of sink into the cell membrane and make them ineffective. And this is what then starts that leptin resistance. Now, a couple of things that just interesting around just how easily leptin can be affected. They know that estrogen deficiency, so when estrogen is low, as it typically is postnatally, it can cause not leptin resistance, but leptin insensitivity, where again, it just starts to affect that signal, and then it increases another brain hormone called neuropeptide Y, and then that can increase appetite. So low estrogen through leptin is increasing appetite, and this during a menstrual cycle, for example, can sometimes explain odd eating behaviors and cravings during the menstrual cycle. And it can definitely explain some of the odd eating that mothers can experience in terms of hunger, and then feeling satiety, or feeling like they're quite full, don't want to eat soon after feeling really hungry and starting to eat. And then if you have too much estrogen, that directly leads to resistance as well. And so especially if you have an estrogen excess, um, before having children, you may already have a degree of leptin resistance moving into pregnancy. So estrogen is one of these interesting Goldilocks hormones with leptin. Too much or too little has quite negative effects on leptin. Um, and then another thing that I see a lot during pregnancy is vitamin D deficiency or vitamin D insufficiency, where it's not deficient, but it's low enough to start causing issues. And that's, the lower your vitamin D, the more likely you are to get a leptin resistance. And one of the key things that leptin helps regulate is um, body inflammation, essentially. So leptin helps keep something called alpha MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. It helps keep it in check. Now, this alpha MSH does a lot more than just regulate your tan, as the name kind of suggests. It's probably the key brain hormone that regulates body inflammation. And so if you have leptin resistance, what ends up happening is you end up getting an upregulation of a really key uh, inflammatory molecule um, of interleukin 6. So interleukin 6 gets upregulated, and that makes you way more prone to any inflammatory thing going on in your body. So and we know that interleukin 6 is also one of the key inflammatory molecules, cytokines, that regulates a lot of the inflammatory issues during pregnancy. If your interleukin 6 is too high, you're much more likely to be getting preeclampsia, small for date babies, premature labor, HELLP syndrome, all these things. Interleukin 6 is a key driver in that. Interleukin 6 is also a key driver in, so if the mother has high interleukin 6, that's a key driver to inflammatory outcomes for that child born from that pregnancy. So they're more likely to have concentration issues, and more likely to gain weight with the same amount of calories that another child without that upregulation of interleukin 6 would have. So it has quite profound epigenetic issues in that child. And so again, it's not super well researched, but it's a pretty profound idea to think that if we can help reduce a mother's inflammation, keep her interleukin 6 down, keep her leptin in a healthy place, her child is going to be much healthier as a result. So the stakes are high, as they always are. And so I keep coming back to this. This is not just about weight gain post-pregnancy, but it's so much more than that. So let's talk about leptin and thyroid. So this hasn't been really worked out as much as I would like it to be, but there is definitely a very interesting relationship between leptin and thyroid. And when I talk about hormones, I always try to give either nutrients or vitamins or hormones a bit of a personality, just to kind of help give a sense of the role that they do. And thyroid, and when I talk about hormones, I talk about a board meeting. So a board meeting that your body is having to kind of regulate things. And the definition of a hormone is a signal from one part of the body to another part of the body through an endocrine organ. So lots of brain hormones within the brain, lots of brain hormones talking to glands, and then lots of glands talking to cells and tissues. And so this is um, uh, the board meeting at play every day. And thyroid is a unique hormone. It's the only hormone that really has only one job to do, and that job is to regulate energy expenditure at the cell level. And so I call thyroid the treasurer, or the CFO, the chief financial officer. Um, and it only came to me very recently, actually, about I couldn't quite figure out the personality of leptin, because leptin is different in the sense that it's actually the cells signaling back to the brain, and then the brain using that signal to then regulate some other key hormones, including thyroid, and any hormone that the hypothalamus is involved in helping regulate, which is essentially most of them. Cortisol is just an example, estrogen, progesterone as well. And so, leptin, in terms of the board meeting, I've decided to call it the auditor. So it's actually going through and auditing what, from a cellular point of view, about these fatty acids coming in, and then giving a feedback to the brain around what it thinks the budget should be, energy expenditure budget. And then the thyroid, so leptin, so if you have leptin resistance, it directly affects something called TRH, which is thyroid releasing hormone. And thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus talks to the pituitary, and then that affects TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, which is the best test to actually see how is your thyroid doing. And so if your leptin's too high, you have leptin resistance, it's actually going to start pushing your TSH too high. And I think a lot of mothers that I see with increasing TSHs after the birth of their child, they've actually got leptin resistance. It's not a thyroid issue. They may have a thyroid issue, but it sometimes can be that we're actually looking at a leptin resistance issue. The research shows also that leptin resistance can increase thyroid inflammation. So that's a pretty big one. So if your thyroid is more inflamed, you're much more likely to get Hashimoto's, especially if you're already on the way to developing an autoimmune disease. And even though this hasn't been conclusively worked out, I think there is enough correlation for us to be thinking that they are linked. And even though the leptin resistance wouldn't be causing Hashimoto's, it's not the match that lights the fire. It is certainly petrol on that fire. And one of the other things that I've seen is leptin resistance seems to cause a mismatch between the key thyroid hormones T4 and T3. They're pushing T4 up, pushing T3 down, and I see a lot of people within the functional medical world spending a lot of time trying to get the T4 and T3 perfect, and they're actually starting to introduce T3 hormones and various other things, and they're not addressing the leptin issue. And if you can address the leptin issue, you may not need to address the thyroid issue, or you may address the thyroid issue in quite a different way. And so, leptin and thyroid, they're not necessarily. I think I heard someone describe it as frenemies, so this friend enemy. They're not actually looking out for each other, and they're in some sort of competition, and they have to regulate each other. And so if one starts to go out, the other starts to get really affected. And something that I just dawned on me recently is I'm always thinking, why are females have a much higher rate of thyroid disease than men? the ratio usually for whatever thyroid disease is a 5 to 1, 5 females for every 1 male getting a thyroid disease or disorder. And my feeling is that leptin is very much implicated in this, and we know that females have a leptin level 3 times higher than men anyway. So, um, and this is part of the reason why females can gain weight so much more easily than men, is because of this already increased leptin. And then if you have estrogen and progesterone that aren't at optimal levels, you can be on this total weight up and down roller coaster uh, that many females just know too well. So, and and a couple of other just issues around that is we might just jump straight to what are the symptoms of leptin resistance. And so and when you have leptin resistance, it causes some pretty major symptoms. It contributes to weight gain, and then it really affects the body to be able to regulate its own weight. It again, it tricks leptin resistance tricks the brain into thinking that it's super skinny. So again, we just have to hold that thought, because every time I tell that to mothers, there's kind of a bit of a chuckle, and well, that makes sense, because the calories in, calories out exercise doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense when you have leptin resistance. When you have high leptin, it also drives comfort eating. Um, uh, and it suppresses a key hormone in the brain called orexin. Orexin used to be called hypocretin, and now it's better known as orexin. And if leptin is suppressing orexin, it actually can make the brain really tired. And so what happens with a mother who's got leptin resistance, she may have leptin-induced brain fog and fatigue for up to 8 hours after eating a meal. And so if you're kind of thinking, well, I'm eating every 8 hours, I've got brain fog the whole time, and I feel better when I don't eat. I hear this all the time. My brain works better. If I don't eat, my brain works better. But eventually I have to kind of eat. And I think that may be part of that orexin effect in the brain. And then it also has this unfortunate effect of activating the microglial cells and activating the sympathetic nervous system. So both of those things can cause excitation in the brain and actually induce the whole stress response in the body. So here, leptin resistance, you eat a meal, your brain becomes more tired, you have more brain fog, but your brain is actually in certain areas becomes too excited, and then your stress response becomes really high. So that's it can be a real disaster for a mother who's struggling with their energy, who's struggling with sort of brain clarity, and it can really cause a whole cascade of sort of things. So leptin resistance for me is really a world of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Calories, sleep, and it can make it very challenging. And I've talked to so many mothers who are totally disheartened because they just can't manage their weight, they can't manage their brain fog, and they just don't know what to do. So if we can understand, starting from this whole starting point of leptin being produced by fat cells in response to fatty acids coming into the bloodstream from food, and then signaling to the brain about energy storage essentially. And then if the brain has receptor damage or inflammation and this resistance starts, you get this whole cascade of increasing weight gain, lethargy, concentration issues, and increased ability, I mean, increased propensity to actually get more stressed. And so that is a snowball. And that snowball, as it rolls, just starts to become bigger and have more effects. So um, it's not something to be sort of taken lightly. And then how do you diagnose leptin? Or leptin resistance? And so most researchers are happy just to do a fasting leptin test. And so the fast is from midnight, no food, until you get a blood test done 8 or 9 a.m. in the morning, and then you measure your leptin at that time. And that's probably the time that it's most stable. Otherwise, it varies a lot, like I said, with eating meals, different times of the day, depending on what your cortisol is doing. Estrogen is obviously implicated in that, and so that's probably the easiest test to do. In Australia, it's not paid for by Medicare. It's usually around $100 to $140. It can often take over a month to come back from the lab, and so it's not a blood test we get the result back immediately, and I'll often just go on clinical basis. Sometimes I'll do a leptin test just either to help provide some insight or help provide some motivation for that mother just going, wow, my leptin is 20 times above the reference range, or it's 5 times above the reference range of, and that strangely can be quite motivating to help look at these issues. Other scientists do a more complicated test where they do the blood leptin and a ratio with uh, leptin receptor messenger RNA, and then they do a ratio. It's called a free leptin index. So it's not something that I've ever done, but and we don't have access to that through the labs in Australia, but that's where the researchers are at. Um, and then leptin has many other effects that I'm not going to go into too much, but it has quite profound effects on the immune system. It can cause a lot of histamine issues. It can actually contribute to autoimmune disease. It down-regulates interleukin 10, which is our main interleukin or cytokine that helps regulate our immune response. So by putting a handbrake on interleukin 10, we're going to become much more inflamed with a small inflammatory trigger just because of that. Kristen's asking what the target level is. So labs differ a little bit, but it's in Australia it's considered 11 or below is considered to be a normal level. I'm pretty sure that the units are standard else in other places. In America, they have the same units. In Europe, they have the same units. So it's not like we're having to look at different units. And it might be nanograms per milliliter. I'd have to actually have a look. But 11 is kind of the cutoff mark. Some researchers thinking that it should be 7, especially the biotoxin researchers. Anything above 7 is considered to be a starting point for leptin resistance. And the number actually doesn't matter. Once you get up above 20, 50, 100, 200, it doesn't actually indicate that the problem's 2 times or 4 times worse, because it's actually a logarithmic, not a linear scale, that once you start getting into leptin resistance. And it's also implicated in allergic reactions, heart disease, cancer. But again, so it has overarching effects on pretty major systems within the body. So I'll answer a few questions now, and then we'll go on and talk about the treatment of leptin resistance. What do we do? And I just spent so Kristen's asking, I don't have any weight problems, but can I still have high leptin? For sure, because there are other things that help regulate weight as well. Thyroid, ghrelin is another important sort of hormone, and then how your body's regulating some of those other inflammatory sort of things. And I see I've definitely I don't only test leptin for obesity or weight gain. I definitely have a look at leptin for brain functions. I'm having a lot of brain fog that is out of proportion to what the other labs are sort of showing. And Jody's asking about what I mentioned was low post-pregnancy. So one of the hormones that tends to be very low, especially in the first few weeks, is estrogen, and so that can really not cause leptin resistance, but really promote leptin insensitivity, which is kind of like leptin resistance, but without any damage to the receptor. Let's have a look at some other questions here. And Jody's saying about how it's so connected. Yeah, it's such a central regulatory hormone, and it is the missing link for me on so many levels. It's really hard to know how someone is doing if you're not really aware of something, leptin and that energy regulation aspect of things. A lot of people, I didn't sort of mention this, so leptin resistance is also found a lot in chronic fatigue. And so with my work with chronic fatigue, regardless of what weight someone is, you can often see leptin resistance, especially people with very low BMI sometimes can have quite significant leptin resistance, which isn't paradoxical, but would be sort of going against what you're sort of thinking a lot of those roles of leptin are doing. But again, if energy regulation is being affected by leptin resistance, and then you have the immune system effects, it can really keep someone in, especially the fibromyalgic type chronic fatigue, because leptin is also involved with pain regulation. I didn't mention that, but it's interesting how people with leptin resistance may start experiencing more pain just as a side effect of that. So what do we do about leptin resistance? What's the magic wand? And there is no magic wand, but essentially what we're trying to do is manage inflammation, and then leptin will start to follow suit. Any work around leptin is slow. I'll often use something called the leptin reset, which is something you can easily find on the internet, but it's the idea of lifestyle and diet trying to help reset your leptin point and help heal leptin resistance. And one of the things with the leptin reset is around really trying to help circadian rhythm. It's what I call keeping things batshit boring. And what I mean by that is getting up at the same time every day, having meals at the same time every day, going to bed at the same time. Leptin loves that in terms of, whereas when you're eating at different times, when you're having to get up at different times, that really gets leptin resistance going. And I think this is one of the big kickers in pregnancy is the sleep deprivation in that first year can suddenly either really exacerbate leptin resistance or it can actually cause it. I've seen a lot of mothers that things are going really well up until a certain time, 6-9 months after the birth of the child. They have some sort of sleep affecting event, and then all hell breaks loose in terms of suddenly getting brain fog, weight gain, thyroid issues, and you'd expect those issues to maybe have surfaced earlier on. And I think that leptin is really what has just thrown petrol onto that fire. So with the leptin reset, the recommendation is to have a protein meal within 30 minutes of getting up, and then actually exposing yourself to full spectrum light within that first hour of getting up. So if you can't actually get outside or open a window, there are certain lights that can help increase some of those red light frequencies to help circadian rhythm, help get your cortisol up to its normal range, and then that can help regulate leptin. Other things with the diet, we mentioned about sort of protein in for the first meal, but overall increasing protein can help, and reducing carbohydrates, interestingly, can also help with leptin resistance, and having smaller meals. So when we overeat, that really gets our leptin up and gets that leptin resistance. It's just like a spinning wheel. And what we're trying to do is just slow down the spinning wheel, and then the body can start to self-regulate. And then from a diet point of view is also really looking at an anti-inflammatory diet. That's a little bit different for everyone, but looking at sugar, looking at gluten, looking at dairy, looking at processed carbohydrates. And again, I don't put everyone onto a low sugar, no gluten, dairy free diet. I really start to explore, is gluten your friend or not? Is dairy okay for you, and what types of dairy are okay for you? Butter might be fine, milk might not be, and there are different reasons for that. But it's really trying to find some of those key inflammatory triggers. Your diet doesn't have to be 100% perfect, but you need to get rid of some of those highly inflammatory foods. Um, and then the next thing within diet is probably, I think, the most successful thing in regulating leptin resistance, and that's the idea of fasting, especially intermittent fasting. And I'm not talking so much about the 5-2, but much more around the 16-8 style of eating, where for 16 hours of the day you're not eating, and you're only eating for the 8 hours of the day. I think that's one of the fastest, most spectacular ways to help regulate leptin resistance. And the research has shown you can still be eating inflammatory foods and start to lose weight with that. Now, the only deal breaker with that is if you're breastfeeding, that can be sort of really challenging and maybe not such a great idea, especially in the first 6 months of a child's life where there's exclusive breastfeeding going on. I think once a child's a little bit older, I'm okay for my mums to do intermittent fasting with let's say a 12-month-old or those kind of things. Or an older child that isn't needing all their nutrition from mum. And then your cortisol and thyroid have to kind of be in some sort of alignment. So Jody's have asked here, would I recommend intermittent fasting with hypothyroidism? If your thyroid level is okay, I'm totally fine with that, and it can actually really help with thyroid health as well. I think if you've got untreated hypothyroidism, you're probably not going to get into fat burning very easily. So, um, so, so that intermittent fasting is for me kind of not the secret weapon, but the crucial one. And even if you're doing a 14-10, you're going to get some of the benefits from that. And sometimes we have to kind of do some correction around thyroid and cortisol before we even get access to the benefits of intermittent fasting. Kristen's asking here, when would you consider retesting after starting the reset? Well, for me, the leptin costs $140 and it takes 6 weeks to come back once we've done the blood test. There's one lab in Sydney that will sort of do this. And so whenever I do a leptin, I'm getting this delayed result. 6 weeks after you do it, you're getting the result back in. And so 6 weeks is a long time when you're doing a lot of these sort of things. So I often don't retest leptin unless someone's dealing with morbid obesity. And then we can kind of track things. And what's been interesting for me is I'm probably doing less and less leptin testing as time goes on, but I have a lot of mothers who really want to know what their leptin is, and so they request it. And it's really interesting to see how much it can sort of fluctuate. I had one mother recently with quite severe leptin resistance post one of her pregnancies. She did a lot of work, got her weight down, was feeling fantastic. Actually got her leptin down to normal. I don't see that very often. Once you've got leptin resistance, you're just trying to get your leptin down to close to 11. So anything in the teens, anything from 11 to 20, I'm actually really happy with. She managed to get her leptin down to, I think, 4 or 5, something quite. Had another pregnancy, and then her leptin just blew out again. And not because she was doing anything wrong. I think it was just the sleep challenges of having 2 children, and and already been almost sensitized from a leptin sort of point of view. So in terms, so Kristen, I much more look at how the clinical picture is. So if we're looking at weight loss, how much weight loss are we looking at, and how are we doing from a brain point of view, energy point of view, and that whole kind of regulation of that energy state. Um, and I'd only retest the leptin if we're kind of getting stuck, and I'm thinking there's something that's not quite adding up here. Is there another issue going on that we haven't seen, or is this still the leptin issue that we just haven't been able to kind of grapple and support? Um, so other things you can do about leptin resistance, reducing your stress, super important. So this whole thing around the autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic versus sympathetic, leptin resistance actually pushing up your sympathetic response, making it harder to relax. The stress reduction, I think, is also a really key thing. This is also part of that batshit boring that I keep joking to mothers about. So part of batshit boring is also just not having too many surprises, not having too many things that you have to do, not many too many expectations, and not having a super long job list, and not racing around trying to be the perfect mother, ticking every box, getting every job done. Um, when you're dealing with leptin resistance, you really have to just park a lot of those things and just go, I need to, as part of my treatment for this, I actually really need to get my stress levels down, um, and experience some boredom, experience lots of downtime, and start to do activities that will really help induce that relaxation response. And the research is pretty clear about that. This is not just a nicety, this is actually part of the frontline management of leptin resistance. Um, a few other, and then obviously sleep. So the big four for me: food, intermittent fasting, stress reduction, and sleep. So the two things around sleep are one, just making sure you're prioritizing sleep, making sure you're getting enough sleep for what you need, because it's very easy to stay up 1 or 2 hours or 3 hours after the children have gone to bed just so you have your time, and then you're just slightly underslept. Again, knowing that part of the cure of leptin resistance is circadian rhythm, and then just keeping everything regular. And now the body loves that, the leptin receptors love that, and then leptin will just beautifully come down over time. And another deal breaker that I'm seeing more and more of is sleep apnea. So part of what happens, you gain weight, you have a lot of inflammation, extra weight gain around your neck, and then the inflammation causing some laxity of collagen around your neck can actually induce um, snoring and sleep apnea, and then suddenly you've got a problem you didn't have before, and you can do all the things that I've mentioned, and that sleep apnea isn't going to allow anything to budge. And so this is especially true for me for mothers who are waking up feeling like a zombie, feeling totally terrible, regardless of how much sleep they're getting. Usually, a mother who's exhausted, brain fog, leptin resistance, they get 1 or 2 nights good sleep, they start to feel a bit better. So that's a real clue for me that sleep apnea may be there. You don't have to be snoring to have sleep apnea. Um, no, snoring is just a clue that you may have sleep apnea. And then again, a lot of people who snore don't have sleep apnea as well. But the issue with sleep apnea is that you have periods where your breathing slows down and your breathing stops, and that then put during your sleep, and then that induces a panic reaction within the body as CO2 builds up, uh, and if that happens several hundred times a night, which it can with people with sleep apnea, your sleep quality is going to be terrible, and you've actually just had more inflammation during your sleep than you have had during your day, and so sleep's not restful at all. Um, Other aspects that I sort of look at is trying to normalize estrogen. So again, testing for estrogen, is it too high or too low? Knowing both of those things can exacerbate leptin resistance. And so there are some great herbs that can really help with that. Occasionally I will give estrogen short term to help really balance things, especially if estrogen is super low. But it shouldn't be something I think it's something that you shouldn't really need as a medium or even as a long-term thing if we're looking at this. And one of the other interesting things that there's more and more research coming out on, and we can thank the Iceman, Wim Hof, for really pushing a lot of the research in this, but this is cold therapy and cold shower. So, and the research is quite clear. Cold therapy really helps increase interleukin 10, really helps decrease interleukin 6. They're pretty key players in leptin resistance, helps increase the amount of brown fat within your system, and directly helps reduce the leptin signal. So your leptin resistance goes down. Now, most mothers are pretty horrified when I bring up this idea of thinking about a cold shower. And to be honest, the more horrified you are by the thought, possibly the more the benefit you're going to get from doing that. And I'm not recommending the full ice bath and I'm not talking about excessive cold exposure as well, and I'm not even talking about getting particularly cold. So there are two different types of cold. One is central, being cold centrally, and then the other is being cold peripherally. So just getting cold on the outside of your skin versus getting cold within your core are totally different things. And getting cold within your core is actually not what we're after, and that can actually have negative effects. It's about getting cold on the outside. Then the body retains all the warmth in the central part, and then from doing that, you can actually get the sort of the benefit. So what I recommend people start doing, if you're interested in this, is what's James Bond made famous, and that's called a Scotch shower. And so a Scotch shower is where you start warm, do your washing, do all the kind of things you kind of need to do, and then just switch over to cold for 2 minutes. Depending on where you live, it will depend on how cold the water gets. The really important thing with this is actually really regulating your breathing. You don't want panic breathing because that you're going to reduce the benefit. And this is where some of the Wim Hof techniques can be quite useful, where he really gets you to be aware of your breath. But basically, if you can just do a controlled breath in and a controlled breath out as you're turning it to cold, and as the cold is kind of hitting your skin, just to try to really keep that slow breath in and even slower breath out, and it can make all the difference. So I'll answer any questions if they're there now. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of leptin and leptin resistance and why it's so important for mothers. It's such a big topic. I'm amazed that more isn't sort of talked about this. I'm amazed that there aren't more textbooks on this. And like I said, it's the missing link. It is the auditor within the hormonal board meetings. It plays a really key role. And if you have dysregulation of leptin within, again, this tiny part of the brain, the flow-on effects can be massive, and they can be ongoing. So once inflammation is the spinning wheel of leptin resistance is set in motion, it may not correct itself. And so this is where we need to do what we can. I really encourage mothers to look at their health issues. And if you're having brain fog and weight gain, or if you're having brain fog that isn't really letting up, or if you're eating food and getting brain fog from food, for this idea of a food coma, but it's not pizza, it's any kind of food can cause this sort of food coma. I'd be really looking at the sort of leptin issue. Thanks for tuning in, everyone. Hopefully I answered all your questions today, but if there are any more questions around this, please message me, and I'm really happy to sort of, with one of my Q&As, maybe do a little bit of a deep dive into one aspect of leptin. If someone wants to have any more illumination on this really sort of fascinating topic. So thanks everyone, and we'll see you next time.